Hello, everyone. This is Monica Anderson with Software Toolbox. I'm standing in for CSIA Executive Director Bob Lowe this week. He's on vacation. Thank you for attending the October CSIA webinar. Today's webinar will provide insights on staffing and effectively managing project teams. Be sure to ask questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. Questions will be answered during the webinar, so be sure to ask them. We are recording this webinar, and it will be archived for later viewing, and the slides will be available as well. The host and sponsor of our monthly webinars is Software Toolbox, a CSIA partner member. Software Toolbox understands that you are not just buying Software Toolbox, but investing in a relationship where you depend on your suppliers to be there every step of the way. One of many products Software Toolbox offers is the Galaxy Toolbox for Wonderworld System Platform, a tool to reduce HMI screen and application object creation time by a factor by 120. Visit their website to learn more. I would like to introduce today's webinar presenter, Dan Rossler. Dan is the author of Control System Migration, a practical project management handbook. His career, spanning over 20 years, began as a process control engineer and project manager for a major chemical company. His background also includes roles as a project and proposal manager for system integrator and business development and marketing manager position with major automation vendors. Dan is currently the owner of Dan R. Consulting, which provides content marketing, business optimization, and product management service to engineering, software, and manufacturing companies. So with no delay, Dan, I'm going to hand this over to you.
Thank you, Monica. So welcome, everyone. It looks like we have a good turnout today. What we're going to be discussing is how to staff and effectively manage project teams. And just a quick note that one of the key resources for much of the information you'll see in today's presentation is from Chapter 5 of my book, Control System Migrations, the Practical Project Management Handbook. For more information on the book, you can visit my publisher's website, www.momentumpress.net, and search for my name, or you can feel free to contact me after the presentation. So what we're going to be covering is a number of different aspects around project staffing. Our discussion will start with what a team is and how to pick the right players, what staffing tools we have available to us to help us manage our teams, and also we want to talk a little bit about what defines the attributes of a good team and how to make your team stronger. And finally, we're going to talk about the real-world balancing act that most integrators typically have to face with limited resources, project schedule overlap, and other challenges. And along those same lines, we'll talk a little bit about what organizational decisions impact project staffing. So we'll look at it from that angle as well. So a little bit about why we're discussing this topic. Staffing seems like a pretty straightforward issue, right? Well, I'd like to share an anecdote of why this topic's near to my heart. As a project manager, I was working on a large project with roughly 15 resources, plus a number of subcontractors, so we had a total team of around 60 people or so. And the project was staffed with a senior I&E designer, and we'll call him Joe to protect the names of the guilty. And we also had a junior controls engineer, and we'll call him Bob. Joe had about 20 years of experience, so maybe a little bit more, and he had kind of grown up in the field design generation. And what I mean by that is Joe believed in touching the physical wires. He enjoyed being in the field, and you know, I think that that's part of a good design effort. And he liked to you know, walk down his jobs and spend a lot of time, you know, making sure that point-to-point connections were going to be solid and that kind of thing. And he was also very adept at using in tools, but in general, he was a physical world kind of guy. Bob, on the other hand, was in his late 20s, He had grown up as part of the computer generation, and you know, Bob kind of believed that 99% of everything he needed to do or ever would need to do on a project could be done sitting in front of his computer. So there was two different mindsets here. And one of the tasks on the project was for Bob to provide some control system addressing to Joe. And I noticed that we were starting to fall behind on our schedule, so I confronted Joe and asked, you know, what's going on? And his response was, Bob hasn't given me the addresses yet. And so I proceeded to ask him, well, you know, have you asked him about him? He's been sitting in his office for the last 2 weeks. And Joe said, no, he's never available. And I was a little perplexed by this and said, well, what do you mean? And his response was, yeah, he's always over there, but he's got those headphones on, and it doesn't look like he wants to be bothered. And there was the fundamental cause of a 2-week delay in our task on my project, because Bob liked to listen to music, and there was a different mindset from Joe's. And so as humorous or silly as this example might sound, it points out that there's a humanistic element to every project that can't be ignored, because most of the time when projects fail, it's not because of the technical solution as much as because of the people, communication breakdowns, and lack of cooperation. So we're going to be looking at some of that today as well. So when you think about a team, what's your definition of your project team? Well, a general definition is that a typical team can be defined as a group of individuals who are working towards a common goal. That sounds pretty simple, right? Well, as my anecdote hopefully illustrated, it isn't as straightforward as we commonly think. So we're going to talk about the specifics of team characteristics and challenges more in a minute. But for now, let's take a look at what a typical automation team looks like. So when you think of an automation team, who makes up your project team? Well, often as integrators, we might tend to think of our project team as our internal team because that's who we have direct control over. But as most of us know, the reality is that the client and the entire client organization is part of our team, and other external parties are part of our team. Maybe a DCS vendor, or maybe you've got a construction subcontractor and a construction manager you're dealing with because you don't have construction capabilities in-house. So our team can quickly become fairly complex, and it's actually even more complex than what I've shown here. For example, I've shown designers in a generic fashion, but the reality is that on many automation projects, you have multiple disciplines that are working on the project. So you have an I&E designer, you have maybe you're doing a new control building and you've got an architectural designer, you may have civil or mechanical designers. So quickly this expands into a fairly large and convoluted group of individuals. And as a project manager, your job is to actually get everyone on the same page and working in the same direction. So when you think of your project team, you want to think of your team in the broadest terms possible. And the reason is that you want to understand both the needs of everyone involved and also the responsibilities of all the parties involved and how they need to work together, where the handoffs are, and that kind of thing. So if you have an idea of what roles comprise your team and you're at the stage of filling in the blanks, then on an org chart, then one of the things that you want to look at is personalities. What does your ideal team member look like? Is your ideal team member the loner? Or maybe it's the whiner? Maybe it's the socializer? Maybe it's the know-it-all or the attention getter, or it could be the people pleaser. And any of these individuals could be your best technical resource. These are just personality types, and the reality is that not all of them fit well together and not all of them work well together. So staffing isn't only about the technical expertise. If a technical expert is difficult to get along with and can't work well with others, personally, I probably don't want him or her on my team. There are plenty of projects where that personality type will work well, but it's typically in a single resource project role as opposed to a larger team. So while I realize we don't always have the luxury of picking our ideal team members, you want to give some thought to the mix and understand how your team members function and how they work so that you'll know how to build an effective team that's going to work well together and find some success. So if you have the loaner and the socializer on a project team together, you're probably the loaner's probably going to get frustrated really quick. So what do you as a project manager need to do to make them more effective? Don't just ignore the personalities and think that everything will go smoothly. Make it a conscious part of your decision process when you're staffing projects to think about how these individuals work together and how, if you've got to put personality types together that aren't necessarily a good fit, how can you facilitate their success? So how do we pick our teams? Well, to get a winning team requires technical skill or competence, plus some intangibles. And each of us has to define what those intangible elements are for us. Sometimes they might be things like communication skills or a cooperation because maybe you've got a difficult client that you're working with that's going to provide some challenges, and you need someone who's going to be able to facilitate that interaction. Maybe it's time management skills, or maybe it's a willing personality, a can-do kind of person. But whatever those things are for you, whatever those intangibles are for you, you should spend some time thinking about them and trying to define them so that you can build your team in the way that's going to be productive and successful. So let's face it, as integrators, oftentimes we don't have choices. We've got a limited number of resources in our organization. So what we should do in that situation when we've got to pick these teams and we know that there's going to be some issues and they're not going to be ideal, is we need to work on recognizing what those issues are up front and then finding ways to manage them. And let me give you an example. If you have a whiner personality that's on your team and you know the individual likes to just spend time complaining and venting, then plan as a PM to stop by his or her office 10 minutes twice a week and just ask how things are going. That will give that individual an opportunity to vent and feel like they're being listened to, which is often all they're looking for. So while you as a PM may feel like you have too much on your plate to spend time managing personality styles, it is an essential part of being an effective PM and team leader. And often the small proactive things that you do can head off issues during execution later in the project. So let's look at what are the tools that we have available to help with project staffing. Well, the first and highest level is an org chart. And org charts help define project reporting structure. They also identify key roles and personnel, and they do this for both client and team members. So org charts are kind of the high-level look. The second level down, or a bit more granular, is a roles and responsibilities matrix, or a RACI chart. And fundamentally, RACI or roles and responsibility matrices clarify who does what. They assist in identifying when and to whom things are handed off. And they create accountability both with the client and the system integrator team. And when you're building a RACI or a roles and responsibilities matrix, you want to build it as part of the broader team, a broader audience. We looked at a little earlier the client organization and the external vendors. You want all of them incorporated into your roles and responsibilities matrices because you're going to have times where you need to work with those individuals to get things done. And the third tool, which is the most granular, is the project schedule. And the project schedule identifies task-level responsibilities through a work breakdown structure. It also designates predecessor and successor dependencies. Maybe most significantly, schedules, when done properly, should allow you to validate or cross-check your staffing plan with your budget and desired timeline. For example, if you have a task with 40 hours of work and you've set aside a duration of 2 days for that task and a budget of $1,200, if your staffing plan is to have one principal engineer at a bill rate of $125 per hour do that task, you can already see the discrepancy. There's no way that one individual is going to do 40 hours of work in 2 days, and there's no way that a guy that's billing at $125 an hour is going to do a 40-hour task in $1,200. So you can start to see some of those discrepancies, and while this one's a very blatant and obvious one intentionally so that it shows you the discrepancy, the reality is that some of our staffing really isn't as obvious where we've got some shortfalls. So looking at that, something that can help you from a cross-check. And there are other detailed staffing plans you can use, but these kind of the three common tools. And another point that I want to drive home is that these tools are not just paperwork. They communicate valuable information to the internal team and to your client. Don't shortchange them. They should be part of your detailed review during your project kickoff, and they should be referenced throughout the project. Many organizations create these to satisfy a line item in the RFP, and then they never look at them again. So these should be something that is an ongoing value to your organization. So here's a quick look at an org chart, and I know that all of you are familiar with org charts, but in this case there's a couple of things I wanted to point out. First, the designation of our expanded team. So rather than just creating an org chart that shows the system integration company, you want to create the org chart as the overall project team with the control system vendors, the construction company, and the end user. I like to color code mine, but however you want to do it, you just want to be sure that everyone's built in. And this may not be something that you do at the proposal phase. You know, at the proposal phase, you just may offer up your organization. But as you get into managing the project, you want to expand it and think of your team in terms of those broader groups. The second thing is that you'll see I've got specific individuals listed here in the org chart for most of the designations. However, on the construction company, I've got a couple that are generic, Unit A construction team, Unit B construction team. And what I really wanted to say about this is that there are times, particularly at the proposal phase, where less detail might be better, but when you get into project execution, you want to get into very specifics, and you want to make sure that you've got individuals listed. And part of the reason that you want to do that is that as system integrators, we know that oftentimes our people have to wear multiple hats. So you want to look for conflicts. So for example, if I had Jane Smith as the lead controls engineer and I also had Jane as the quality manager, there may be a conflict of interest there because she may be the one checking her own work. So that's something you want to look for. And you also want to look for people who are spread too thin. While yes, we have to wear multiple hats as system integrators a lot of the time, you also want to make sure that you haven't put the same individual in so many of these positions that they're not going to be successful. So those are some things that you want to look for when you're doing an org chart. Now let's take a look at roles and responsibilities matrices. There are a number of ways to do these matrices, and actually there's even a number of different designations for the RACI nomenclature. So for example, some people use accountable as the A. I like to use approver. For me, approver makes more sense because I think everyone in on the team is accountable. But you should use whatever terminology makes the most sense to you, but be sure that you define it so that everyone's on the same page as to what the designations mean. And while some people may consider the RACI designations a little bit of overkill, they can be extremely valuable in helping you consider whether you've covered everything and whether there's clarity in people's roles. So for example, if you're creating your RACI and you find a task where it's a gray area, where you're not certain who's responsible, or you look at it and it's kind of a dual responsibility, that's something you probably want to spend some time on in your kickoff meeting, because if you've got questions about who's responsible for that task, I guarantee you that other people on the team will end up having questions about it at some point. So identify those hazy areas early on in a project, and that can prevent confusion and drop balls during later stages of the execution. And the last tool that we talked about was schedules, and I'm not gonna pull up a schedule. All of you guys know what schedules look like. There's a number of different common scheduling tools on the market. The main thing, regardless of whatever software scheduling tool you're using, the main thing to remember is that they represent a granular staffing plan, and they allow you to track who's doing what, when, and the predecessor and successor relationships and the interdependency is also something that's extremely valuable in schedules. So that's typically the tool that we use on a regular daily basis when we're managing our projects as far as staffing and people go. So I see that we've got a question here. What about a single technical lead or a design coordinator to ensure that controls is in sync with I&E? And you know, the answer to that question is that, yeah, absolutely. You know, the specifics of what your organization looks like really depends on the project that you're doing and the complexity of it. You know, if there's a larger project and you've got a lot of different disciplines working on it, then you probably want to have someone who's really focused on some of those individual disciplines, or kind of supporting the project manager in making sure that things go smoothly from a more granular standpoint. So what are the attributes of or characteristics of a strong team? Well, you know, for most of us, we might automatically think the strongest team is the collection of the most technically talented individuals. But if any of you are sports fans, you know that it's not always the most talented team on the field or on the court that wins. The reality is that there's other things that are critical parts of strengthening a team and making a strong team. Fundamentally, you have to have technical competence. You also have to be able to communicate, to coordinate, to collaborate, and to cooperate with one another. And these are what I consider kind of the 5 C's, or the 5 essentials of building a strong team. And if your team is doing these things, you will have success. It doesn't mean you won't have issues, but you will work through those issues to minimize their impact to your project. So let's look a little bit more at these, and I'm going to share another anecdote with you. And this is one that's about how easy it is to drop the ball on some of these C's, mainly coordination, collaboration, and communication. So I was managing a project where our team was migrating a control system, and we were reusing existing marshalling cabinets, existing I/O cabinets, and some of the existing field wiring. And we had very limited real estate within the rack room. And I had a senior designer on my team who spent a lot of time in the field checking cables and validating physical space in the cabinets. And it was really a puzzle of which pieces went first, and the order of execution was extremely important because we were having to pull specific cables and land them in cabinets that were already freed up so that we could then free up other space in other cabinets. So it was up to this designer to kind of get the design going, and he spent a great deal of time in the field, and he put together a very good design. But what he didn't do was he didn't do a field constructability walkthrough with our field construction manager ahead of issuing the package. And this designer, you know, he had 30 years of experience, and he felt he had covered everything, and you know, I had confidence in him. But when we got to the construction phase, our construction manager called me and asked me to come to the rack room, and he proceeded to point out that one of the cables from the field was 1 foot short for the cabinet that it was designated for. And the reason it was short wasn't because the cable length was too short. It was because we had to route around a floor support for a raised floor in the rack room. And because of the other underfloor cables, we didn't have any options for routing. We basically had to route around this. And so we ended up having to talk to the client and put in an intermediate J-box, and that's certainly not an ideal design. And the point of this anecdote is that different team members bring unique perspectives, and it's the collective team that builds the best design. And if my designer had appreciated that, he would have sought out the construction manager for input, and we could have avoided these complications, because the construction manager is looking at it from a different perspective than the designer. And so everybody brings value to the team, and that's one of the reasons that communication and collaboration are so important. So what was the lesson from this experience? Well, there were several. First of all, I'd always rather promote over-communicating before under-communicating. And second, you know, people should be asking questions, and they should be seeking input. And they should be looking to leverage the experience and perspective of all the team members. So where are the common issues in teams? Where do teams typically fail or run into issues? Well, most frequently, it's in the handoffs and transitions When they hand off or exchange information with one another, or when they transition responsibilities for work, for example, you may have one person who's configuring points and another who's configuring logic, and they're having to work together on transitioning the responsibilities from the point configuration to the logic configuration, something like that. A second problem area is when team members fear delivering bad news. And for instance, they might know that they're trending behind, but if you've created an environment where they fear that they're going to look bad or that there's going to be repercussions if they tell you they're trending behind, then they're probably going to keep quiet, and they're probably going to keep just working away, hoping they're going to catch up. And the reality is they won't many times. So, you want to be cognizant of the fact that the environment and tone that you set as a project manager can impact your project very negatively or very positively, depending on how you set up the organization. So let's look at another one, which is unrealistic assessments of progress. In automation projects, we don't deal in the physical world. If you're laying brick for a house, it's really easy to see that you're either making the progress you should or you're not. You're falling behind. But in automation projects, that's not as easy to do. It's not as easy to gauge when you're doing graphics configuration whether you're 80% complete or 90% complete. It's not as easy to gauge when you're configuring logic, where you're at in that process. So this is where the project manager needs to take a trust but verify philosophy. And what I mean by that is that when you ask for a progress report, don't settle for the tell me, but ask or insist on the show me. So you really want to be finding ways to validate that someone's reported progress is what they say it is. And I know I'm not the only project manager that's been told someone was 80% complete with the task, and 2 weeks later, and another 80 hours worth of charges, he or she is still 80% complete with the task. So, that's a reality that we deal with. And so how do you get around that? Well, one way is to get another set of eyes on it. And that may be a QA/QC reviewer. It may be a technical lead or design coordinator that has the responsibility of kind of validating progress. But you want to be making sure that the progress that's being reported is actually being made. There's a couple of other common areas for failure on teams, and the first is just the basics of poor communication skills, and the other is personality conflicts. And while these are things that we don't like to acknowledge as being problematic within our organization, the reality is they happen. Sometimes we can anticipate them, and we can do things to mitigate the risk of these areas impacting our project. So as a project manager, you should always be thinking about what can you do to head off some of these things. So teams are like muscles. Exercise makes them stronger. But how do we exercise as a team and when can we find the time? Obviously, with the resource and time limitations that you have, you can't spend a tremendous amount of time doing team building types of things. But my philosophy is when you have large projects, when you have new team members or a number of new team members, or you've had past issues on projects, it's worth the time and investment of a few hours for team building exercises. Several years back, when I was at another organization, we won a project that was the largest our office had ever been awarded. And we had a large team assigned, several engineers that hadn't worked with one another. So I got a room off-site and had a 4-hour internal kickoff and team building meeting. And most technical or analytical people cringe at the thought of this. And many of you are probably cringing right now. But believe me, I understand. I'm an engineer too. We don't like to spend time on the humanistic side of things. However, in this particular case, our team had some recent challenges on projects, and I knew as PM I couldn't afford to have communication breakdowns on this particular project. So what I did was I reviewed the scope, and then we did a 15-minute team building exercise. And then I reviewed the schedule, and we did a 15-minute team building exercise. And so we worked them into the kickoff meeting so that it wasn't just us sitting around a table talking with one another the entire time. But by the end of the session, our team knew what my expectations of them were, and they also knew what each other's expectations were, and they had improved the understanding of one another. And believe me, when I said we were going to do some team building, I had several engineers that immediately became stoic, and you could tell that they absolutely didn't want to be there, and they were thinking about all the other things that they could be doing, that they needed to be doing, rather than sitting in this room. But those same team members came up to me within the next few days and told me how much they had enjoyed and learned from the process. And they made statements to me like, I never knew that about him. That explains why he approached the last project that way. And so what it did was it began to break down some of the barriers and walls of communication. So what should we try to accomplish with team building exercises? Well, the first thing is we want to promote communication. We want to build trust. We want to develop an understanding of the different personalities. And we also want to create an appreciation of the skills and backgrounds of everyone. And then looking at how we can strengthen our teams beyond just team building exercises, one of the ways is using processes that encourage consistency. It's easy to get off course without a roadmap. So processes can give our team members all the same roadmap and get us moving in the same direction. The team that wins is the team that has some guidance. And one of the things I want to make a point about is that when I say processes don't need to be bureaucratic or cumbersome. And I think that oftentimes organizations make the mistake of thinking that as they build a process, they have to build in every what-if scenario. And so they create these cumbersome processes that actually become a hindrance rather than a help. The reality is that processes should give guidance, but we should also recognize that our team needs to have some leeway in how they do things. So, there's a balance there. And the final comment is that practice in working as a team is an absolute necessity. None of us would expect the team that wins the Super Bowl this year to have never practiced and only showed up the day of the Super Bowl or the day of the game. But yet, we expect that from our organizations oftentimes. We often wait for that huge project before we actually work together as a team. We need to be working as a team on smaller projects too. We need to create the environment that really balances the needs of projects with the fact that we need to be improving our organization. So that's something to consider. So we've covered kind of the ideal ground on staffing, but let's face it, seldom do we have ideal circumstances, and most of us as system integrators have to live in the real world where there's a continual balancing act required. Some of the most common challenges that we have are limited resources, both in sheer numbers and in specialized system, process, or client knowledge. For example, if you have a Siemens PCS7 project in the queue, you might only have one resource familiar with that particular control system. And so you have little flexibility about who you're going to assign to your project. But if it turns out that same resource is also your Delta V expert and is working on a large Delta V upgrade for your best client, then you run into the next issue, which is project overlap and key resource conflicts. How do you handle them and how do you manage them? So we'll talk about that in a moment. And the final thing is there are A, B, and C players on our team, and we need to talk about the necessity for each. And the final point I want to make is that good organizational management from a business, operations, and sales and marketing side breeds project management success. PMs on their own, without the supporting organizational infrastructure, have a low probability of success. So now let's look at these key system integrator challenges a bit more. And right now, we're moving a bit into operational management, but looking at it from the perspective of how it impacts projects. So there are successful key system integration companies of all sizes, and many factors determine how large your company is or how much you might want to grow. But given that you have a finite number of qualified resources, there are some things that impact your projects directly and your ability to staff them appropriately. So what are they and how do we overcome them? Well, the first is the organizational decision, which is what I kind of call the chicken or the egg philosophy. Do you hire your resources before you have the work, or do you wait for your work before you hire your resources? There are project impacts to each approach. If you wait to hire until you have the work, then you're bringing in new people who have to learn the organizational structure, have to learn your business processes and work processes, have to get to know their teammates, and that's a lot to burden a project with, and that ramp-up time can increase your project cost and potentially affect your schedule. The alternate approach means you have overhead burden because you brought somebody in prior to the workload, and the first thing that most organizations do is look for ways to make them billable, and the reality is that oftentimes projects get burdened with additional resources that weren't expected. So, you know, there's impacts to whichever philosophy your organization uses, and the important thing is that while there isn't a single right answer, organizations need to understand there are ramifications to their staffing policies that impact projects directly. And it really becomes somewhat of a pay now or pay later decision. The cost may or may not be equal depending on the circumstances, but at some point you have to decide what your philosophy is, and as an organization you need to give thought to how that affects PMs and projects. The second important consideration regarding resource limitations is that training and mentoring on projects is not only valuable, but it's essential. For instance, if you have a single system expert on Yokogawa DCS and a project comes up on that DCS, then as an organization, you need to look for ways to leverage the expert in a coaching role and begin the process of training other engineers on the system. You have to be cognizant of any potential cost to the client, but within the confines of good business practices, you can find ways to drive the organization towards a higher point by having others contribute and learn. And what this does is it diversifies your resource pool on individual systems and helps your organization to become more responsive in the future. And finally, another key element that organizations need to consider with regard to limited resources is sales opportunity tracking. Strong sales opportunity tracking can put your organization in the driver's seat because it gives you a good idea of what's coming and when. And by knowing this, you're enabled to have a more proactive staffing plan in place that prevents you from lagging too far behind or moving too far ahead of the curve on resources versus workload. So that's a fundamental that most organizations have some methodology for, but may not always be effective. So now let's look at project overlaps and resource conflicts. How do we overcome the challenges of having resources that are needed on two projects at once, both in critical stages? Well, the first approach is avoidance through planning. There are a couple ways this is commonly done in system integrator organizations. Some integrators have an operational or a business manager who tracks company resource loading and has the capability to identify that in the second week of December, engineer A is going to have 90 hours of work spread out over 3 different projects. And when that situation is identified, adjustments can be made, maybe to the work assignments, to the timing of the task, or maybe other resources can be reassigned to help. But you know, however it's done, it gives you the option of making adjustments ahead of the conflict of the issue happening. And other organizations sometimes use project manager meetings, either weekly or biweekly, and they kind of leave it to the project managers to identify those issues and work out resource sharing among the staff. However you do it, you just want to be sure that you're identifying those issues before they actually become a problem. And in addition to avoidance, the second methodology that's often used is to have contingency staffing and options. And this might come in the form of cross-office load sharing if you are a multi-integrator office, or a second common methodology is to have overflow partners. You know, you have consultants or independent contractors that you bring in to support your team through crunch periods. So, you know, keep in mind that you should always be looking at how do you avoid these issues and have some planning in place to do that. So finally, we're going to talk a little bit about A, B, and C players. And when I say A, B, or C players, I'm referring to the overall skill set, the specialized automation system knowledge, and et cetera. I just want to make the point that this nomenclature isn't intended to suggest that someone who is a C player isn't an excellent employee or can't make great contributions to the organization and to your clients. Don't necessarily think of C players as non-performers. It's oftentimes just a limited skill set or a very specific skill set. So it used to frustrate me that we had people on our team that I couldn't sell to a client as a principal engineer or designer who could pretty much handle whatever they had come up. And you know, I was discussing this with someone one time, and they explained to me that we needed resources who did the background work and others who had limited but specialized skills and expertise. So when you're trying to staff jobs, that's kind of problematic because you're trying to keep your entire organization billable as an operational manager or even as a project manager, you're trying to keep people billable. And really your ideal resource is the A player who can pretty much do it all. It's the individual who's an expert and can learn on the fly or adapt. But the problem is those A players aren't always readily available. The reality is there's limitations on the number of A players out there. And so when you're staffing projects, you want to look at matching your talent to the task. Don't have a principal engineer who has a bill rate of $125 an hour doing graphics when other people in your organization can build those graphics. So have the principal engineer in a QA/QC review role for those graphics, or as a consultant if issues arise and the team needs some support on more complex graphics issues. But you want to look for ways to use your entire team and use the skill set that's most effective at the job at the highest value to your client. The second point is that neither you nor your client want to pay for all A players. A players cost a lot of money, both to organizations and to clients. So unless your organization's a niche specialty integrator, maybe someone who focuses on advanced control, you're likely not going to be competitive on jobs if you have a team of all A players. So you need to recognize the value of B and C players and how they integrate into your overall plan, both on individual projects and within the organization. And that brings us to the last point, which is that you want to use A players in your organization as mentors and coaches for the B and C players to help broaden their skills, to give them more depth of system knowledge, etc. Because different levels of skill sets within your organization are a necessity. And it's important that you find ways to build your organizational structure and your project work processes so that you can leverage the skills of all of the individuals. So while we as system integrators may have challenges that prevent us from always staffing to the ideal, we also have opportunities to be creative about how we handle those challenges and move our organizations forward. This not only helps our individual project staffing, but also our organization as overall. And we should always be thinking about the next project as well as the current one when we're talking about looking at training opportunities and those types of things. So in summary, you want to broadly define your team so that it is inclusive rather than exclusive. Ultimately, your client and potentially vendors and other contractors or consultants can impact your success, so they are part of your team. When building and managing teams, don't ignore the human factors like communication or personalities because they will impact team effectiveness. And when building and managing your teams, also remember that leveraging staffing tools such as organizational charts, RACIs, and schedules help clarify roles and responsibilities and communicate key task accountability. Know the common issues that cause teams to fail and proactively manage around and through them. And don't think good teams just happen. They require practice, so take the time to strengthen your team. System integrators have many resources and staffing challenges. Get creative about how you solve them, and your team will find success. So thanks to everyone for your time today. Many of the concepts we've discussed are included in my book. While the title calls out control system migrations, many of the principles discussed in my book are applicable to broader automation projects. For more information, visit my publisher's website, www.momentumpress.net, and search for my name. You can contact me at info@danrconsulting.com as well. I'll take any questions at this time. So I see one question that came in. So my question, how do you overcome fear? What tools or coaching or process can you use? And that's in regard to the point that oftentimes team members are fearful of saying, hey, I'm lagging behind. And really, I think that the main tool that you have there is really, as a project manager, creating an environment of communication where you're engaging your team members and you build some trust with them. You know, and also I would say this, a lot of times individuals are fearful of bringing things up in front of other people. So it's a lot easier to have a conversation about the fact that you're lagging behind on your work with a project manager or a single individual as opposed to in a team environment. So a lot of times project managers have weekly team meetings. Oftentimes that's not the best place for someone to bring up that, hey, I'm 5 hours behind on this task. So be walking around and engaging your team members from time to time and giving them opportunities to talk with you about where they're at. So that's one area that I would say you could do something, but it's not an easy problem to solve.
Dan, I had a question come in, but I think that's what you just answered. What is some of the effective team building exercises that work for engineers? That's what you just answered, right?
No, actually, that's a little bit different, Monica.
Okay.
Let me speak to that. So, one of the things that I think I would say is they don't have to be complex exercises, and specifically, we've all played the whisper game where you start on one end of the table and somebody whispers something, and by the time you get to the other side of the table, it's a completely different message. That's a great, as simple and silly as that game may sound or that exercise may sound, the reality is it's a great way to show that communication breaks down. And not everyone who says one thing hears the same thing. And so that's a great one to do. I also like to do team building exercises where I ask my team to fill out answer some questions ahead of the meeting. They may be questions about their background or questions about what are your favorite movies or why do you like what do you like to do on your off time, things like that. And then I read some of those out during the exercise and have people guess who it is, and whoever gets the most right, kind of wins the game. And what that does is it actually is a great tool for just breaking down the barriers and making everyone relate to one another a little bit better, because when you don't know people or you don't really understand their background or where they're coming from, it's oftentimes you don't give them the benefit of the doubt. So what you're really trying to stress there is that, hey, we're all human and we all have interest, and it starts to build some knowledge of one another and some background and an appreciation for where people's perspectives and where they're coming from.
Good. I have another question for you. Dan, what tools do you use to track resource loading?
Yeah, resource loading, I actually typically just track it using scheduling tools, as far as on an individual project. As far as organizationally, I've actually used Excel to do that in the past, and built a spreadsheet that had projects and the different workloads and hours and so forth on it. So I typically don't go for complex tools. I try to use the simplest tool available to me to do the job.
Thank you. And I have another one here. How often would you suggest the project manager seek progress on a project? Daily, once a week, once a month?
Honestly, it depends. It depends on the type of project you're doing. It depends on where you're at in the project. For example, if you're at a critical period, you may be wanting to get more frequent progress reports. So it really is variable. And you know, if the project's very complex, it's something that's critical to your organization, then you probably want to have more frequent contact in terms of understanding progress and getting that feedback. Whereas if it's something that your organization feels pretty confident in your capabilities to do, you know, maybe weekly's fine. It also depends on the length of the schedule.
We got a couple of questions coming in here by chat. Give me a sec here. Will all items be considered to strengthen the team except team together? Let me read that again. Will all item can be considered to strengthen the team expert team together?
So what other items might be used to strengthen the team besides just getting the team together, I think is the question. And yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, as I said, I think processes are one thing that can strengthen your team. You know, by giving guidance and making sure everyone's on the same page. I think communication from a project management standpoint in terms of making sure that you're clear on what your objectives are, on what your expectations are, is another thing that strengthens your team. But, you know, ultimately, you know, teams have to be able to work well together. And so I would go back to those items that I pointed out as being some of the common challenges, right? It's the handoff and transition period, for example. You want to build processes around those things so that everyone's clear on where the handoff occurs and you know what their responsibilities are. It's not just I did my piece of work, here it is. It's I did my piece of work, but now another piece of work needs to be done. How do I make sure that that individual has the knowledge they need to do their job? So, you know, I think it's in clarity of roles and responsibilities, and it's in business processes.
I got another question here for you, Dan. Sometimes contractors with a special skills are used on team projects. How do you get contractors to join the team concept by asking questions with challenges?
Yeah, so that's always a challenge. I mean, the reality is that organizations all operate differently, and when I talk about expanding your project team, the reality is that sometimes you may run into obstacles to actually building a strong team with some of those individuals or organizations because they're outside of your organization. But you know, I would say that it's really about identifying what's going to be a win-win and you know, identifying what's going to give value to them, and then finding ways to you know, I guess bring them into the fold and into the mix. And I know that's kind of a vague answer to the question, but I guess that my feeling is that you have to just start with communication and trying to create an open communication environment with them, and you know, ask them to participate in meetings, and maybe even having some time where you actually communicate with them outside of the meeting and start to build some trust there is important, because sometimes they can be adversarial relationships if they view you as a threat to their work. But the thing is that for the overall team to be successful, every individual on the team has to be successful, and I think that's the point that you have to drive home.
Okay, I got another for you, Dan. Have you ever handled a technical competent member of your team that refused to follow a process? How do you handle it?
Okay. Could you read that one more time, Monica?
Sure. Have you ever handled a technical competent member of your team that refused to follow process? How do you handle that?
Okay, yeah, I mean, the reality is that I think every project manager's ran into that issue. And, you know, I think it really depends on how your organization's structured and, you know, what the individual's personality is like. But one of the things that, you know, I think that you have to do in that situation is you really have to look at balancing putting too much constraint on that individual versus not enough. And what I mean by that is that if there's a process and they're not really on board with using it, but yet they're a very technically important resource to your project, you don't want to just give them free reign and say, okay, well, just do it however you want it and just kind of let it fly. Because if you do that, you're basically giving them permission to not cooperate. And that's not something that I think is beneficial to your project, and it's certainly not beneficial to your organization. However, at the same time, you know, oftentimes some of their resistance is stemming from the fact that they don't agree with the process, or that they have issues with how the process is impacting their work. So I think the first thing that you typically would want to do in that situation is really sit down with them and say, okay, here's the process. You're not using it. What are your suggestions to make it better? And by doing that, you start to get the conversation going about what their issues are with the process and why they're not using it. And oftentimes, you know, that can help you to start to get them on board a little bit. But don't ignore it. Don't just say, okay, well, that person's not going to use the process, so I'm just going to ignore it and let them go on doing whatever they want to do the way they want to do it, because that's not going to be a positive thing for your project or for your organization.
I don't have any more questions coming in, so we're going to go ahead and close this out. If I do have any question coming in during this, Dan, I'm definitely going to let you know. So to all of you, thank you for being at this webinar. My hope is that you have several takeaways that take you a bit closer to expert project management. Dan, thank you very much for your time and expertise. Your presentation was very insightful. We wish you the best. Keep up the good work. As always, it was a pleasure for Software Toolbox to be the host and sponsor for CSIA monthly webinar. Be sure to complete the survey for today's webinar. It will arrive in your inbox within the hour, and it only takes 30 seconds to complete. Your feedback is necessary for our continuous improvement. So in the closing, here are the 3 important things. The next and final webinar on project management is Wednesday, November 19. Title is Surprise, Your Project is in Christ. On December 3rd is a webinar on risk management of subcontractors. Also, the exchange, get on it if your company isn't already, with a gold profit. Profile is the best value. It's an amazing tool for end users to find integration and suppliers. And finally, if you have a suggestion topic for a webinar, include it in your survey comments. This is Monica Anderson with Software Toolbox. Thank you again for attending. And I didn't have any more questions. Let me double check here, Dan, before I close this out. I think I have a question for you here, Dan. You still there?
Yes.
What about a single technical lead or design coordination to ensure that controls is in sync? Thinking about...
I answered that one earlier.
Oh, you did? Oh, you did?
Yeah, that one was one that I
don't think we have any more. I don't think we don't have any more. So thank you, everyone, and for attending, and goodbye.